themselves can change the psyche, or?
Well, the politics of pollsters is fascinating on its own. So yes, I think in a way the more information the better. If we start to see 2 or 3 or 4 polls all coming towards one kind of result, that matters. If we see one poll like this where the methodology stays the same and it's 1,000 people, and we see the methodology staying the same and they do it every month, we can go for trends rather than actual outcomes. They themselves say in the actual documents that this is not a snapshot, this is not a prediction, this is just what this 1,000 people said on this specific time. So it's really the trend that matters rather than the final result. Bear in mind the 2 big political parties, the ANC and the DA, will have their own tracking polls in the field anyway. They'll have far more detailed information. They're just not going to share it with us.
I differ. I think if it's good, they may. I can't remember last time. But let's move to the list conference now. So you've written about the listing games, saying it's probably the most important front on which a battle for the future of the ANC is being fought. Explain how this is so important.
So the ANC's list conference is the start of its process of determining who will represent the party in the National Assembly, the National Council of Provinces, and in the provincial legislatures. Now, if you recall, towards the end of 2017, the National Assembly caucus in Parliament was used really by Jackson Mthembu, the Chief Whip, and others to try and almost corral then President Jacob Zuma. They were able to place certain limits. So remember, for example, the inquiry, which was of course shown on the SABC late into the night into Eskom, what happened around the SABC itself and the inquiry that led to really the removal of Claudia Motsoeneng finally at that time. And so you can see how important the parliamentary caucus can be to the internal politics of the ANC. Now, there's some evidence to suggest that that particular meeting, you remember the photograph with Ace Magashule, former President Zuma, etc. Who took it? We still don't know. And so what you would have is that meeting, it seemed, was about the list process. If, for example, there is a group of people who want to weaken President Ramaphosa, you would do it through the list process. You'd make sure the National Assembly, particularly, is dominated by people who oppose him. That places boundaries on his behavior in terms of whether he can rely on the caucus or not. That's the first point. The second is that he has to choose all but 2 of his ministers, his cabinet, from that caucus, and so you can limit his choices. So this is a really important battlefield, but in all sorts of ways. If you were a branch in Mpumalanga and you didn't like Deputy President David Mabuza, you can send a signal to the ANC by not nominating him as Deputy President, for example.
Well, there is this simple narrative that President Cyril Ramaphosa maybe had to work with his political enemies, Ace Magashule, even David Mabuza. He would then consolidate his power and sort of shake that off. Is that too simplistic?
Yes and no. It's not, and I think that is still by and large what is most likely to be happening at the moment. But there are severe hurdles, and I think it's not certain that that will happen. And I think this list process is probably the biggest obstacle in the path of Ramaphosa to that kind of outcome. So what's actually happening now, and it's very difficult to predict this process. There are provincial list conferences, there's a national list conference. In the end, these things end where they always end, the National Executive Committee of the ANC. And that's probably going to have the final say. Bear in mind, just to add to the fun, there are also sort of provincial dynamics to take into account. So some branches in Northwest might nominate Supra Mahumapelo, but to actually put him on the list at a time when the ANC's lost significant support in Northwest might actually be quite a dangerous thing to do.
Well, how much of an election issue is this, sort of the corruption links on that list?
So, in a way, this is going to be about how the DA and the EFF campaign. And I think for both of them, but particularly for the DA, it's very hard for them to campaign against President Ramaphosa. So they're going to campaign against people like Deputy President Mabuza or Ace Magashule. So if, for example, there are prominent people high up on the list, so for example, people around, say, Batapile Dlamini, the Minister for Women in the Presidency, you know, who the Constitutional Court has said actually actively misled judges as part of that process, then they can use that to campaign against her, and that would be problematic. In Gauteng, for example, imagine the difficulty in whether you put someone who's on your provincial executive committee, Kaldani Mahlangu, onto your list when she is held directly responsible for Isidameni.
Yeah, but cheap points for the other side. Okay, so Bosasa, that came out over the weekend. How damaging for the president? So initially we had this R500,000 that went to his son. The president said he had seen the contract. Then, oops, it was actually campaign funding from Bosasa. Now Bosasa is saying there's no contract at all with Ramaphosa's son.
So it's becoming a little bit of a tangled web. I think for the Democratic Alliance, the prize here is to try and show that Ramaphosa is, to use language they might use, just like everybody else in the ANC.
Took a bribe.
End quote. Yes. And to say he's no different. So don't believe the reformist agenda. And I think that's what they're saying. Helen Zille, the leader of the DA Premier in the Western Cape, has a sort of column out today, sort of trying to convince people not to vote for Ramaphosa, but to vote for the DA. And I think that suggests that they are very worried about that. So they're trying to score points. The second thing, though, is I think everyone knows that what happened at Nasrec was a multi-billion-dollar patronage election by secret ballot in which the incumbent lost. That is quite surprising. That's not normally what happens. And I think what that suggests is that most voters probably know that money was involved in that internal contest, not to buy votes, but literally to campaign. And so, in a way, they're not surprised. And of course, what's fascinating is that the other side in the ANC, or the other sides in the ANC, aren't using this themselves, because the obvious response would be, and where did your campaign funding come from?
Yeah, but for Cyril Ramaphosa himself, this looks like he's lying, or he has to act confused again. I mean, the PR fallout, or do you think it'll go away quickly?
So I think there are two problems. The one is that he could look dishonest. And I think that's probably a bigger problem. But the second, and I think this will matter to him personally and politically, is that he could look incompetent. He could look like he doesn't actually know what people were doing in his name. And then you always have a classic political problem is, do you disavow it? Do you say you shouldn't have done that? Or not? Because you're saying it to people who supported you and in the end actually got you elected. And that's always a difficult political problem for any political leader. So I think it does do him some damage. But I think generally speaking, most voters who might be supporting the ANC anyway, that 54%, are probably inclined to forgive him this one.
All right, so talking about political problems, let's end with Floyd Shivambu's, because his brother was named in the VBS report. EFF said, well, he's not his brother's keeper, but now sort of more direct evidence of that VBS connection.
Look, I don't think that'll be the last biblical quote of 2018. I think there's several things to it. The one is, I think the EFF could quite rightly, and it would be fair for them to say, why is everyone focusing on us with VBS when it was mayors from the ANC who put municipalities' money into these councils from where it was looted? I think the response from most media outlets would be context matters. And the context is that the EFF has been saying we're not corrupt, we're different, we will fight corruption, and yet here's 16 million rand. The story that came out late yesterday in Daily Maverick suggested that Floyd Shivambu had actually received money or received a home loan from VBS. He didn't actually live in the house, it was for relatives of his, but had received money after using some sort of influence on the chairman of Vele Investments. Now, what this does is it suggests that he's linked to corruption. And there's so much more evidence coming out and so many reports. And interestingly, Shivambu has not decided to deny the reports themselves. He hurls insults. He was quite rude to the reporter in question in this case. I mean, that's his democratic right, I suppose, although I don't know if swearing at someone helps you politically in any way. I think it weakens you, generally speaking. But what it does mean is that he hasn't put up what the lawyers would call an alternative version. So he hasn't explained himself. And that means that these reports, as they keep coming, are going to keep suggesting that the word corruption and the EFF go together in the minds of some voters.
Although that brings us back to the beginning, which suggests that maybe some of their supporters aren't actually looking at that. We have to end it there. Thank you so much, Stephen Grootes, SAFM Sunrise anchor and commentator.